Before this story begins, take 1 second to subscribe, because stories like this remind us how powerful the truth really is, once it finally gets a chance to speak. The week my younger brother asked me for $12 million, my mother set the table with crystal glasses I'd bought her 14 years ago. She didn't remember that part. She never did. She set each glass like she was arranging the evidence for a trial only she understood, deciding, plate by plate, who in this family had earned the right to something beautiful. My brother got the chair at the head of the table, the one that had always been his. I got the folding chair wedged in the corner by the radiator that never quite worked, the one nobody else wanted. My name has been on a house my parents always told people they bought for their son. It had been there for 14 years. Not one person sitting at that table that night knew it. But by the end of that evening, they would all learn exactly who had been holding that house up the entire time. I'll get there. Stay with me until the end, because the part nobody saw coming is worth the wait. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories. My name is Renata Cole. I'm 36 years old, and I built a private nursing agency out of one elderly client and a borrowed car. This is the story of the Christmas my family finally learned what my silence had been quietly paying for. If you have ever been the strong one nobody thought to thank, this story is for you. Drop a comment, and don't forget to subscribe, because what happens at that table changes everything. I drove in from Pittsburgh the Saturday before Christmas, the same drive I'd made every year since I left home. 90 minutes of gray highway, then the turn onto the street in Erie where I grew up. Same wreath on the door. Same inflatable snowman slowly losing air in the side yard. Inside, the kitchen smelled like rosemary and butter, and the old cuckoo clock over the table ticked the way it always had, loud in every silence nobody wanted to fill. My mother, Patricia, stood at the stove with her back to me. "Renata," she said, without turning around. "Use the good glasses. They're in the cabinet." I opened the cabinet, and there they were. Crystal, etched with a thin silver vine along the rim. I remembered buying them. I remembered handing my card to the clerk when I was 22, because my mother's account was overdrawn and my brother needed something elegant for his engagement party. I never got paid back. I never brought it up. I lined the glasses anyway, one beside each plate. 6 settings. My brother's seat at the head of the table. Mine by the radiator that hissed but never warmed the room. My father, Walter, came in smelling like the garage, and clapped my shoulder like I was a delivery that had finally shown up on schedule. "There she is," he said. "Our busy girl." That had always been my title in this house. The busy one. The one who didn't need anything, because needing things wasn't a role they'd ever assigned me. I had paid for more of that house than anyone sitting in it would ever know. And I was about to find out exactly what that was worth to them. You learn a family's math early, if you're paying attention. Mine was simple, and it never changed. When my brother, Theo, wanted to go back to college at 27, my parents paid his tuition twice, because the first attempt didn't take. When his apartment became too expensive, they quietly covered his rent for almost 2 years and called it a rough patch. When his car got repossessed, my father drove out before sunrise and paid the lot in cash, so the neighbors wouldn't see the tow truck. I learned about all of this secondhand, told at holiday dinners like warm little family legends. My own hard years, I handled by myself. That was simply the role I'd been handed. At 18, I asked my mother to co-sign a $400 deposit on a studio apartment. She looked at me over her coffee mug and said the sentence I'd hear in 100 different shapes for the rest of my life. "Honey, we can only ever bet on one horse." She meant Theo. She always meant Theo. She believed, the way some people believe in scripture, that a son carries a family's name forward, and a daughter simply carries herself. So I carried myself. I worked double shifts. I paid that deposit out of tip money I'd hidden in a coffee can. And every Christmas, I drove home and watched the one horse get fed a little more. I used to tell myself it didn't touch me anymore. That Saturday, lining up crystal glasses I'd paid for 14 years earlier, I almost believed it. Then my mother turned, smiled at me, too sweet, the way she smiled right before asking for something, and said, "How's the little nursing business doing these days?" I understood, the way you understand weather changing, that something was already moving. She had never once asked me that question before. I just didn't know yet what she'd heard. In case you think I was the kind of woman who sat quietly in a cold corner chair and simply absorbed it, let me tell you how I got out. I left home at 18 with 2 duffel bags and a certification I'd paid for myself, certified nursing assistant. It meant I could bathe someone who could no longer bathe themselves, lift a man who had fallen, sit beside someone at 3 in the morning when the fear got loud. My very first client was an 89-year-old woman named Eleanor Voss, and she rearranged the shape of my entire life. Eleanor had buried a husband and outlived one of her own children, and she did not tolerate foolishness, including mine. That first week, I apologized for everything. The weather, the traffic, taking up space in her kitchen. Eleanor set down her teacup and looked at me over her glasses. "Stop that," she said. "People treat you at the price you set for yourself. You're handing yourself out for free." I never forgot it. I started charging what my hours were actually worth. I started saying no. Eleanor became the closest thing to a real mother I had, which is a strange thing to say about a client, but family is mostly just whoever shows up. I spent nearly a decade learning the one lesson my own parents had never taught me. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And you can be the strongest person in any room, and still be the one quietly carrying it. I just hadn't yet learned how to put the room down. That lesson was still coming. It arrived wearing a red Christmas sweater, with my mother's voice standing right behind it. The signature happened when I was 22. By then, I had something my parents suddenly needed: clean credit and a small but real savings account. Theo had found a house he wanted badly. A modest 2-bedroom with a maple tree out front. The problem was Theo. 2 repossessions behind him, a credit score that barely registered, and a job he'd held for exactly 7 weeks. No bank would touch him alone. So my parents drove out to see me on a Sunday, with a folder under my father's arm and a plan already decided. "We just need your name on it," my mother said, sliding the papers across my kitchen table. "It's a formality. You've got good credit. It protects the family." My father added the line that finally got me. "You'd be helping your brother build something. He needs the leg up. You've already got yours." I was 22. And more than anything, I wanted to finally be the daughter who helped, instead of the one simply expected to be fine on her own forever. So I signed. I didn't co-sign the way you'd back a friend's small loan. They put me on as a co-borrower. On the mortgage note itself, my name listed beside Theo's like a partner. I even contributed $4,000 of my own savings toward the down payment, after the gift money my parents had promised fell through at the last minute. They told me I'd be taken off within a year or 2, once Theo got steady on his feet. I believed them. That was the last time pure trust ever cost me that much, because after that, I learned. But the signature stayed. And so did my name. For 14 years, on a house my entire family would swear, without blinking, they'd bought for their son. I want to be honest about something, because I know exactly how this sounds. I didn't stay on that loan for 14 years out of weakness. I tried to get off it more times than I can count. Here's the trap, and it's a real one. When you're a co-borrower, you can't simply walk away. The only way your name comes off a mortgage is if the other person refinances the entire loan into their name alone. And to refinance, Theo had to qualify independently. He never could. Every time I pushed, the bank gave the same answer. His income wasn't steady. His credit was still a mess. The loan stayed exactly where it was, both our names locked to it. So I faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. If Theo missed a payment and let the loan default, it wouldn't just sink him, it would crater my credit too. The same credit I needed to build a company out of nothing. So when he came up short, which was often, I quietly made up the difference. A few $100s one month, $1,200 the next. I logged every single payment in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Not because I planned to use it, but because that's what nurses do. We chart everything. You write down what you give, so you never lose track of yourself in the giving. Theo never knew. My parents never knew. They were too busy telling neighbors how they'd bought their son a house, to ever notice that the credit holding that house together belonged to the daughter they swore didn't need a thing. The golden sun was standing on the strong daughter's name. He just never thought to look down at the floor. While I was quietly holding up Theo's house, I was building something of my own, and nobody at that table ever asked about it. It started with Eleanor, when her usual home care agency kept sending different aides who didn't know her medications, her routines, her fears. I started covering the gaps myself, off the clock at first, then on it. Other families in her building heard. They wanted someone steady, someone who actually showed up, someone who treated their parent like a person, not a line item on a chart. I hired 1 aide. Then 3. I named the company Lantern Home Care, because a lantern is the thing you carry into a dark room so somebody else doesn't have to be afraid in it. I ran it out of a 10-year-old hatchback with the check engine light permanently on, and a card table in my apartment. I learned payroll at midnight. I learned licensing, billing codes, scheduling, the entire brutal arithmetic of caring for people for a living. 9 years later, Lantern had over 80 caregivers across 2 counties, and a reputation as the agency that never dropped a client, no matter what. That reputation became the asset. A larger regional health group came calling. The way they always do once something small is run well. They wanted to buy. I spent 4 months in conference rooms full of lawyers, holding firm on the one term I refused to negotiate away. Every caregiver kept their job, no exceptions. The day the deal closed, Lantern sold for $22 million. I sat in my car in the parking garage and called the one person I actually wanted to tell. Not my mother. Eleanor. Good, she said simply. Now don't you dare let anyone make you feel small for it. I should have written that down too. The sale closed in late September, 3 months before that Christmas. I told almost no one. People assume you'd want to announce a thing like that you'd finally want your family to see you. I didn't. I already knew exactly what would happen the moment they learned there was money. I'd watched it happen to other people my whole life. Money doesn't change who a family is. It just turns up the volume. So I kept it close. I paid off my own small mortgage in Pittsburgh. That first week, I apologized for everything. The weather. The traffic. Taking up space in her kitchen. Eleanor set down her teacup and looked at me over her glasses. Stop that, she said. People treat you at the price you set for yourself. You're handing yourself out for free. I never forgot it. I started charging what my hours were actually worth. I started saying no. Eleanor became the closest thing to a real mother I had, which is a strange thing to say about a client, but family is mostly just whoever shows up. I spent nearly a decade learning the one lesson my own parents had never taught me. Being needed is not the same thing as being loved. And you can be the strongest person in any room, and still be the one quietly carrying it. I just hadn't yet learned how to put the room down. That lesson was still coming. It arrived wearing a red Christmas sweater, with my mother's voice standing right behind it. The signature happened when I was 22. By then, I had something my parents suddenly needed: clean credit and a small but real savings account. Theo had found a house he wanted badly. A modest 2-bedroom with a maple tree out front. The problem was Theo. 2 repossessions behind him, a credit score that barely registered, and a job he'd held for exactly 7 weeks. No bank would touch him alone. So my parents drove out to see me on a Sunday, with a folder under my father's arm and a plan already decided. We just need your name on it, my mother said, sliding the papers across my kitchen table. It's a formality. You've got good credit. It protects the family. My father added the line that finally got me. You'd be helping your brother build something. He needs the leg up. You've already got yours. I was 22. And more than anything, I wanted to finally be the daughter who helped, instead of the one simply expected to be fine on her own forever. So I signed. I didn't co-sign the way you'd back a friend's small loan. They put me on as a co-borrower, on the mortgage note itself, my name listed beside Theo's like a partner. I even contributed $4,000 of my own savings toward the down payment, after the gift money my parents had promised fell through at the last minute. They told me I'd be taken off within a year or 2, once Theo got steady on his feet. I believed them. That was the last time pure trust ever cost me that much, because after that, I learned. But the signature stayed. And so did my name. For 14 years, on a house my entire family would swear, without blinking, they'd bought for their son. I want to be honest about something, because I know exactly how this sounds. I didn't stay on that loan for 14 years out of weakness. I tried to get off it more times than I can count. Here's the trap, and it's a real one. When you're a co-borrower, you can't simply walk away. The only way your name comes off a mortgage is if the other person refinances the entire loan into their name alone. And to refinance, Theo had to qualify independently. He never could. Every time I pushed, the bank gave the same answer. His income wasn't steady. His credit was still a mess. The loan stayed exactly where it was, both our names locked to it. So I faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all. If Theo missed a payment and let the loan default, it wouldn't just sink him, it would crater my credit too. The same credit I needed to build a company out of nothing. So when he came up short, which was often, I quietly made up the difference. A few $100s one month, $1,200 the next. I logged every single payment in a small notebook I kept in my desk drawer. Not because I planned to use it, but because that's what nurses do. We chart everything. You write down what you give, so you never lose track of yourself in the giving. Theo never knew. My parents never knew. They were too busy telling neighbors how they'd bought their son a house, to ever notice that the credit holding that house together belonged to the daughter they swore didn't need a thing. The golden sun was standing on the strong daughter's name. He just never thought to look down at the floor. While I was quietly holding up Theo's house, I was building something of my own, and nobody at that table ever asked about it. It started with Eleanor, when her usual home care agency kept sending different aides who didn't know her medications, her routines, her fears. I started covering the gaps myself, off the clock at first, then on it. Other families in her building heard. They wanted someone steady. Someone who actually showed up. Someone who treated their parent like a person, not a line item on a chart. I hired 1 aide. Then 3. I named the company Lantern Home Care, because a lantern is the thing you carry into a dark room so somebody else doesn't have to be afraid in it. I ran it out of a 10-year-old hatchback with the check engine light permanently on, and a card table in my apartment. I learned payroll at midnight. I learned licensing, billing codes, scheduling, the entire brutal arithmetic of caring for people for a living. 9 years later, Lantern had over 80 caregivers across 2 counties, and a reputation as the agency that never dropped a client, no matter what. That reputation became the asset. A larger regional health group came calling. The way they always do once something small is run well. They wanted to buy. I spent 4 months in conference rooms full of lawyers, holding firm on the one term I refused to negotiate away. Every caregiver kept their job, no exceptions. The day the deal closed, Lantern sold for $22 million. I sat in my car in the parking garage and called the one person I actually wanted to tell. Not my mother. Eleanor. Good, she said simply. Now don't you dare let anyone make you feel small for it. I should have written that down too. The sale closed in late September, 3 months before that Christmas. I told almost no one. People assume you'd want to announce a thing like that you'd finally want your family to see you. I didn't. I already knew exactly what would happen the moment they learned there was money. I'd watched it happen to other people my whole life. Money doesn't change who a family is. It just turns up the volume. So I kept it close. I paid off my own small mortgage in Pittsburgh. I set the rest aside, untouched, because I'd learned the hard way that the first instinct of people who've never built anything is to spend what someone else built. I even did the responsible thing. The thing I want you to notice. I called the bank holding Theo's loan one more time, and asked, again, what it would take to release my name. Same answer. Theo would have to refinance. Theo still couldn't. So I let it sit, told myself I'd deal with the house in the new year, and went back to my quiet life. I almost made it. What I hadn't accounted for was my sister-in-law, Maris. Maris had a habit of scrolling through local business news, and one afternoon, she scrolled straight past my company's name. A local write-up. Lantern Home Care acquired in 9-figure regional deal. My photo, small, in the corner. She read it twice. Then she did the thing that started everything. She called my mother. I know exactly how that call went, because Maris likes an audience, And later she told the story like she'd done me a favor. She read the headline aloud slowly, "The way you'd lay down winning cards. 22 million. The article says 22 million. My mother went quiet. Then she asked Meris to read it again. Here's what I understood. The moment my own phone started ringing more in 1 week than it had all year. The family that had been invisible to me for 36 years had suddenly become extremely interested in me. My mother called on Tuesday, sweet as the rosemary chicken she'd be making for Christmas. We never see you anymore. Come early this year. Theo texted, which he never did, something cheerful, stacked with exclamation points. My father called to ask if my car was running all right, which was his way of circling money without ever saying the word. I watched it happen with a strange, settled calm, because I'd already predicted every move. That's the job. You learn to look at a staircase and see exactly where someone is going to fall. I looked at my family, and I saw exactly where this was heading. What I hadn't decided yet was what I was going to do once it arrived. I had a house with my name buried in its paperwork, a notebook full of quiet dollars, and a brother who was about to discover the floor under his entire life belonged to me. I just hadn't decided whether to pick it up yet. I almost didn't drive home that Christmas. Something in my gut said don't. But Eleanor was 91 now, and I'd promised her I'd stop running from rooms I had every right to sit in. So I went. The calls kept coming that week, and they kept changing shape. First it was love. Then, slowly, it became need. By the second week of December, my mother had stopped pretending the calls were about missing me. Your brother's going through a hard stretch, she said. You know how that house eats money. I knew better than she did how that house ate money. I'd been feeding it for 14 years. He's too proud to ask, she went on. But a family helps each other. You're in a position now. There it was. Finally, the position. He could use a little help getting current. You don't need it. He does. She said it the exact way she'd said it my entire life. Like a law of physics. You don't need it. He does. As if need was the only currency that ever counted, and being capable simply disqualified you from being cared for. I sat in my kitchen in Pittsburgh, the same table where I'd signed those papers at 22, and I felt something old and exhausted go cold and clear inside me. I didn't argue. Arguing was the old role, the one where I explained myself and lost anyway. Instead, I told her I'd think about it. I hung up. And then I did something I had never done in 36 years of being the busy one. I called a lawyer. Not to fight anyone. To finally understand exactly where I stood on a house I'd been quietly holding up since I was barely an adult myself. The attorney's office was above a small bakery, which I took as a quiet good omen. Anyone who works above the smell of fresh bread can't be entirely cold-hearted. His name was Marcus Findlay. Real estate and elder law, 60s, with the kind of calm that only comes from decades of watching families do their worst to each other. I laid it all out. The co-borrower signature. The down payment. 14 years of quiet, unseen payments. The notebook. He listened without once interrupting, which I'd learn is rare in his profession. Let me make sure I understand, he said finally. You are not a co-signer. You are a co-borrower. Your name is on the note, and very likely on the title. He let that settle. That's not nothing, Ms. Cole. That's ownership. I had spent 14 years thinking of myself as Theo's safety net, a burden I quietly carried. Marcus was telling me I was, on paper, half the owner of that house. So what can I actually do? I asked. He spread his hands. Several things. You could sue your brother to recover what you've covered. You could petition to force a sale and recover your share. You could make a great deal of noise. That was the path the room was probably expecting. The one you, watching this, are probably expecting too. The lawsuit. The public reckoning. Dragging Theo's hidden debts into daylight and letting him drown in them. It had a satisfying weight to it. The kind of justice that ends with everyone watching. Marcus must have seen something cross my face, because he added, gently, but noise keeps you tied to that house even longer. Think hard about what you actually want to walk away with. I told him I'd think about it. I was getting very good at that sentence. Before I left, He drew me the picture that mattered most, the hinge the whole rest of this story turns on. A co-signer, he said, owes the debt and owns nothing. They're just a name the bank can chase. A co-borrower is different. You owe the debt, and you own a share. You have rights. You cannot simply be erased. Then the part that mattered even more. The only clean way for your name to come off that loan is for your brother to refinance it entirely into his own name alone. And to do that, he has to qualify on his own merit. I said nothing. In 14 years, Marcus asked carefully, has your brother's financial picture improved enough for him to qualify for that house alone, today, without you? I almost laughed out loud. Theo had refinanced that house 3 separate times that I knew of, pulling cash out each time, leaning harder and harder on equity my quiet payments had protected. His house was a tower built on borrowed weight, with my name as the bottom brick holding it all up. No, I said. He can't qualify alone. He never could. Marcus nodded slowly, like a man watching a puzzle solve itself in real time. Then you have far more leverage than you realize, he said. The real question isn't whether you can act. It's how loud you want to be when you finally do. I drove home that afternoon with 2 roads stretching ahead of me. The loud one, the lawsuit, the public unburdening of everything Theo had hidden for years. And another road, quieter, one I couldn't fully see yet. It was already there. I just hadn't turned toward it. That night, I did what I do best. I charted. I pulled every record I had access to as a co-borrower, and it turned out to be a great deal, because the bank had been mailing me notices for 14 years that I'd filed away without ever truly reading. Statements. Payoff quotes. The full refinance history, spread across my kitchen table. Theo's house told a story nobody in my family had ever heard out loud. The original loan, modest, when we'd first bought it. Then the refinances, one after another, each pulling cash out for something. A boat 1 year. A business opportunity the next. The tuition my parents believed they'd paid for outright had actually been quietly rolled into the house equity. Every time, the balance climbed. Every time, my name went along for the ride, because you cannot refinance a co-borrower's loan without that co-borrower's signature. Every time, they'd slid the papers across some kitchen table, pointed to the line, and I'd signed where Theo's finger landed, trusting it was routine. I had never once, in 14 years, read past my own name. That night was the first time I laid the entire history out flat and actually read what I'd been signing. The house my parents bragged they'd bought their son outright was leveraged to the rafters. And the only reason it hadn't collapsed under its own weight was a daughter quietly covering the months it came up short. I sat there a long time. Outside, my own street was dark, and paid for, and entirely mine. I thought about every Christmas I'd driven home from that table feeling like the poor relation, when the truth had been the exact opposite. I wasn't this family's charity case. I was its foundation. They had simply built the whole house facing the other way, so no one ever had to look directly at me. The folder was in the bottom drawer of my desk. Plain, manila, soft at the corners from 14 years of being moved house to house and never once opened. I made coffee, sat down, and read every page the way I read a patient's chart. Slowly, looking for the thing that actually mattered. Page 4 was the promissory note. And there, at the bottom, beside my brother's looping signature, was mine. Renata Cole. 22 years old, in careful blue ink. The signature of a girl who believed she was finally being trusted with something important. Co-borrower. Not co-signer. Owner. I sat with my finger on that line for a long while. Then I pulled out my real notebook, the one where I'd quietly charted every shortfall for 14 years. And for the very first time, I added it all up. I had never let myself do the total before. $94,650. That was what I had quietly poured into Theo's house to keep it standing. $94,000, from a daughter who'd once had to pay her own apartment deposit out of a coffee can full of tips at 18. I didn't cry over it. I won't pretend I did. I just looked at page 4, and the blue ink, and the number, and I finally understood that I'd been telling myself the wrong story my entire life. The story where I was the one who took. When all along, the ledger had run in the exact opposite direction. That signature on page 4 was the single most important detail in this entire story. Hold on to it. Page 4. My name beside his. $94,650. Everything that happened at that Christmas table came down to those three things. And only one person at that table knew they existed. Me. I called Marcus the next morning and told him to start building the case, the recovery petition for the money, the path toward forcing a sale. I wanted to know what it would take to make my family feel it coming. He gave me the same gentle warning. A lawsuit would tie me to all of them for a year, maybe longer. I told him I understood. I told myself this was the strong move, the one where I finally stopped being invisible and made them all look at the ledger at last. For a few days, that's exactly where I was headed. And then, the way these things do in families, word got out. Maris heard from someone that I'd hired a lawyer. My mother called, rattled for the first time in my memory, demanding to know if I was really going to drag your brother into court over a house. I didn't deny it. I let her sit with it. Let her imagine the courtroom, the public unraveling of everything they'd buried. I'm not proud of how good that felt, for about 4 days. Then, one morning in the shower, I caught myself rehearsing testimony out loud, arguing with a brother who wasn't even in the room, jaw clenched, water gone cold around my feet. I had spent 36 years living inside that family's kitchen. And now I was drawing blueprints for a new room to add onto it, one with a witness stand. That was the night, alone with the folder and the number, that something nagged at me harder than anything had in years. A lawsuit would put me in a room with Theo's lawyer for a year. It would weld my name to that house through every single hearing. I'd be winning, maybe, but I'd still be holding the house. And I was so unbearably tired of holding the house. I didn't yet know what the other road looked like. But I knew the loud one led right back to that folding chair by the radiator. So I went to see Eleanor. Eleanor was 91 now, sharper than people half her age, living in a tidy assisted living suite I had personally helped her pick out. She still made tea like it was a small ceremony. I told her everything. The sale. The house. The signature. The lawyer. The $94,000. She listened the way she always had, hands folded, missing absolutely nothing. When I finished, she didn't tell me I was right, which is, I think, what family is supposed to do. She asked me a question instead. Renata, she said, do you want to win? Or do you want to be free? I opened my mouth to say both. She held up one finger before I could get the word out. They are not the same thing, she said. Winning keeps you in the ring. Free means you walk out of it. She sipped her tea. You have been in their ring your entire life, sweetheart. Even your revenge is just another way of staying in it. The lawsuit. The courtroom. Making them all watch. That is still you. Performing for people who never once clapped. I sat very still. You don't owe anybody your spine, she said. Not your money. Not your years. And not the next 3 years of your life sitting in a courthouse, proving a point they will never admit you've won. She set her cup down. So don't fight them for the house. Just stop holding it up. And let the house finally tell them the truth you've been too kind to say. Something turned over in me. Quiet and final. I had been planning to throw the entire weight of that house at my family, all at once. Eleanor was telling me to simply set it down, and step back, and watch. For 14 years, I had been the one thing keeping it from falling. The most powerful thing I could possibly do was nothing. I just had to finally stop. I drove home with Eleanor's question still turning over in me, and somewhere on that gray highway, it clicked quietly into place. I didn't need to sue anyone. I didn't need a courtroom, or a public reckoning, or a single raised voice. I just needed to stop being the flaw. For 14 years, the only thing keeping Theo's house standing had been me, quietly curing the shortfalls so the loan never defaulted. If I simply stopped, the house would come due entirely on its own. Theo would fall behind the way he always did, and this time, no quiet check would appear from Pittsburgh to save him. His only real way out would be the door I'd been pointing toward for over a decade. Refinance into his own name, which he could not do. He hadn't been able to qualify a loan in 14 years, and he certainly couldn't now, with the house leveraged to its ceiling. Without me, the math only had one answer. The house would have to be sold to satisfy the loan. And when it sold, my name would finally, cleanly, come off it. I'd be free. Not through a fight. Through subtraction. The reckoning my family would never see coming wasn't an attack. It was an absence. I would simply remove the one thing they had never once noticed was holding everything up. It was, in the end, the most me thing I could possibly do. A nurse doesn't break the patient to prove a point. She stops propping up what was never healthy and lets it find its true level on its own. My family had spent 36 years insisting I didn't need anything, and that the golden son needed everything. Fine. I would give them exactly the family they had designed. One where I gave nothing, and we would all finally see who had been holding whom. I called Marcus and told him I was changing direction. No lawsuit. He went quiet for a second. Then I heard something in his voice that sounded a great deal like respect. Tell me, he said. So I did. 2 simple, lawful things. First, I would stop covering Theo's shortfalls, effective immediately. No more quiet checks, ever again. Second, I wanted to formally notify the loan servicer, in writing, that I would no longer be curing payments on the account, and to officially request the process and figures required to release my interest entirely. You're within your rights on both counts, Marcus said. You are not required to subsidize a co-borrower forever. He helped me draft the letter that same afternoon. It was short, unremarkable. The kind of letter that quietly changes an entire life without ever once raising its voice. I notified the servicer of my position. I requested a payoff quote and the requirements for removing my name. I made it plain, in simple language, that any future shortfall would not be covered by me going forward. I signed it. Renata Cole. The same name from page 4, 14 years older now. Then I mailed it 4 days before Christmas. I want you to notice exactly when this happened. The real turning point of this entire story didn't happen at the dinner table. It happened in a quiet post office on a Wednesday afternoon, with nobody watching at all. No speech. No confrontation. By the time I drove home for Christmas, it was already done. The floor was already gone. The house was already falling. They simply couldn't feel it yet. I would be sitting in my folding chair by that radiator when the first crack finally reached them. And the only thing I planned to do, when it did, was tell the truth calmly, exactly one time, and then leave. People keep asking me why I didn't simply write the check and keep the peace. Here's the thing about being a family's safety net. Nobody ever thanks the net. They don't even see it. They only notice it on the day it's gone. When they finally hit the floor they always swore was solid. I had been that net for 14 years. That December, I decided to find out what happened if I simply stepped aside. The early gathering happened on the Saturday I told you about, the rosemary chicken, the crystal glasses, the folding chair by the radiator. That was when the money first came up. We were halfway through dinner when Maris set down her fork, looked across the table at me with a bright, terrible smile, and said it for the whole room to hear. So, are we just not going to talk about Renata's $22 million? The cuckoo clock ticked into the silence that followed. My father stopped chewing mid-bite. My mother's hand drifted to her collar. Theo stared at me like I'd been hiding a second face this entire time. What is she talking about? So I told them plainly, because there was no point hiding it anymore. I'd built a company. I'd sold it. It was a very good number. I kept it short and unbothered, the way Eleanor had taught me. And I watched the temperature of that room change in real time. My mother's shock lasted about 4 seconds before it folded into something else entirely. Calculation. I had seen that exact look on her face my entire life. The look right before we can only ever bet on one horse. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine, warm and a little damp. Sweetheart, she said, that's wonderful. That's such a blessing for this family. This family. Not me. The family. Then, softer, the old law dusted off and aimed directly at my chest. And your brother is struggling so much right now. You don't need it. She squeezed my hand. He does. There it was again. The entire creed of my childhood, recited over a chicken dinner I could have bought 100 of. I didn't pull my hand away. I just looked at her. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel even the smallest need to explain why she was wrong. It moved fast after that. The way these things always do once a number is sitting on the table. My father cleared his throat and started talking about keeping wealth in the family. Theo, emboldened, leaned forward. "Look, I'd never ask," he said, asking. "But the house has been tight. If you could float me something, even just a loan." He named a figure, then a much bigger one. By the end of that meal, a loan had quietly become your fair share to give. As if my company had been some shared family project I'd selfishly cashed out alone. Maris delivered the line they'd clearly rehearsed in the car on the way over. "After everything your parents did for you growing up," she said, "you'd really let your own brother lose his house?" I almost admired the nerve of it. Everything your parents did for you. I ran that list silently in my head. The apartment deposit they refused to co-sign. The tuition paid twice for him. The truck, the rent, the house with my name buried in it. The $4,000 of my own savings in the down payment. Everything they'd ever done for me would fit inside a coffee mug. Everything they'd taken would fill that entire house to the rafters. But I didn't say any of that. Not yet. Theo, watching my silence, mistook it completely for weakening. "Family money comes home to family, Renata," he said, like he was quoting some old wisdom instead of inventing it on the spot. "That's just how it works." I looked at my brother, a man who had never once refinanced his way out of anything, sitting in a house he had no idea was already sinking, lecturing me about how money comes home. "Let me think about it," I said. And I meant it. I had one more thing left to confirm before Christmas Eve. Before I left that Saturday, my father followed me out onto the porch. The storm door rattled shut behind us, the way it always did, on a latch that never quite caught right. He stood with his hands in his pockets, staring at the dead grass. "Your mother shouldn't push you like that," he said quietly. It was the closest thing to taking my side I had heard from him in 36 years. "I know it hasn't been even between you and your brother," he went on. "I do know that." Something in my chest loosened slightly, against my will. I waited. For one foolish second, I genuinely thought my father was about to apologize, and I realized just how badly I had wanted that my entire life. Then he sighed, and ruined it completely. "But you came out fine, Ren. You always do. And Theo? He's not strong like you. He needs the help. We did what we had to do for the one who couldn't make it on his own." There it was. The exact same arithmetic, just wearing a sadder face. I had come out fine, so I deserved nothing. Theo couldn't cope, so he deserved everything. My strength had always been the very reason to give me less. He told me then, almost like a confession, that he'd pulled equity out of his own retirement years ago to help Theo. That things were thinner than my mother knew. That he was scared. And I felt for him. I genuinely did. But fear isn't a deed to my life. "I'm sorry you're scared, Dad," I said. "But you spent your safety net on the wrong child." I drove back to Pittsburgh in the dark. He didn't ask which child I meant. The letter did its quiet work while the rest of the family was busy planning how to spend my money. 3 days before Christmas, the loan servicer processed my notice. The December payment came up short, the way it always did. But this time, no quiet check appeared from Pittsburgh to cover it. For the first time in 14 years, the shortfall simply sat there, unqueued. And the account slid into delinquency. Theo got the notice in the mail that same week. I knew exactly what it looked like, because I'd been the one receiving those notices for over a decade, quietly filing them away. Past due. Action required. A number, with a deadline attached. Theo had never seen one before, because I had always made sure he never had to. He had no idea what had changed. He had no idea the change was me. Finally, simply, absent. He called our parents in a panic instead of calling me, because in his mind, I was now the one hoarding $22 million while refusing to help, never once suspecting that the help had been there silently, every single month, for 14 years, and had simply, quietly stopped. My mother called me, frantic, insisting Theo's mortgage company had made some kind of mistake. I let the call go to voicemail. There was no mistake. There was only, for the first time, the truth arriving entirely on its own schedule. I hadn't needed to lift a single finger at that table. The house was already telling them. They simply hadn't learned how to read its handwriting yet. I had taught myself that years ago. Theo finally called me himself, the night before Christmas Eve. No exclamation points this time. He was shouting before I even said hello. The house was behind. The bank was sending letters. Did I know anything about this? Because the timing seemed awfully convenient, didn't it? Right after everyone found out about my money. I let him run completely out of steam. Then I said the calmest sentence I have ever said to my brother in my entire life. Theo, refinance the house into your own name. Silence. Like I've been asking you to do for 14 years, I went on. More silence. Then a smaller voice, the one underneath all the shouting. I can't, he said. They told me I don't qualify. My credit. My income. I can't get approved a loan. And there it was. The first completely true thing my brother had said to me in years. I know, I said gently. You never could. That's why my name has been on it since you were 27. I could hear him trying to do math he'd never once been forced to do. Wait, he said. Your name? On my house? On our house. Page 4, I said. Co-borrower. I put $4,000 into the down payment, and I've covered your shortfalls for 14 years. A long, awful pause. Then why is it behind now? He whispered. Because I stopped, I said. That's all. I just stopped. I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. I simply let my brother sit, for the first time in his entire life, inside a consequence that had been quietly waiting for him the whole time. See you at dinner, I said. And I hung up. Of course, Theo called our mother the moment we hung up. And of course, she called me right after. And of course, she had already decided who the villain of this story was. That's the thing about a family's arithmetic, when it's only ever run in one direction. Even the truth gets entered on the wrong side of the ledger. How could you? She said. Not even a question. How could you do this to your brother, at Christmas? I asked her, calmly, what exactly she thought I'd done. You're punishing him, she said. You've always resented him. And now that you finally have money, you're using it to ruin him out of jealousy. Jealousy. I had spent $94,000 keeping her son's roof over his head. Money she had never once known existed. And she'd found a way to call that jealousy. I'm not giving him anything, I said. And I'm not taking anything either. I'm simply no longer paying for a house that was never supposed to be mine to pay for. She wasn't listening. She had never really listened. She fell back, the way she always did, on the oldest line in her arsenal. We did the best we could with what we had, she said. We could only ever bet on one horse, Renata. You know that. We told you that. The sentence that had shaped my entire childhood, now offered up as a defense for letting her son slowly drown in debt I had been quietly bailing out for over a decade. For the first time, it didn't land like a wound. It landed like a confession. She had told me the truth about this family 36 years ago. And I had spent every year since trying to prove her wrong by becoming indispensable. I was finally, completely done proving it. I'll see you at dinner, Mom, I said. I called Marcus one last time on Christmas Eve morning, because I wanted to walk into that house knowing exactly what was true, and saying nothing I couldn't fully stand behind. He was careful, the way good lawyers always are. Here's what I can confirm, he said. You've lawfully stopped covering the shortfalls. The account is officially delinquent. If your brother can't bring it current, and can't refinance into his own name, then at some point the lender moves toward the remedies written into the note. Which means? I asked. Which means, presumptively, the house gets sold to satisfy the loan. And my name. When the loan is paid off, whether through sale or refinance, your name comes off it. You walk away clean. That part is solid. That was all I needed to hear. I wasn't going to that table to threaten anyone, or promise outcomes I couldn't guarantee. I was going to tell them, exactly once, what I had already done, what was true, and what I would no longer be doing. Then I was going to put on my coat and drive home, to a house that belonged entirely to me, with no one else's name attached and no one else's weight on my back. I packed a small bag, in case I needed to leave quickly. I didn't plan on staying long. I would say it once, calmly, in front of all of them. And then, for the first time in 36 years, I would let that storm door bang shut behind me, and not turn around to fix the latch. Christmas dinner was set for 6 o'clock, and I arrived at exactly 6, because I refused to give anyone the satisfaction of also calling me late. The house smelled the way it always did. Rosemary and butter. Pine. The little ceramic Christmas village my mother displayed every single year on the sideboard. The cuckoo clock ticked over the table. The crystal glasses were out again, catching the light. 6 settings. Theo at the head. My folding chair by the radiator. Some things a family will never change, even as the floor goes out from under it. They were all there. My mother, tight-faced and righteous. My father, who wouldn't meet my eyes. Theo, gray and hollow, like a man who hadn't slept, because he hadn't. Maris, perched beside him, watching me the way you watch whether you yourself started. An aunt and uncle down the table, clearly briefed in advance, faces already arranged into disapproval. The whole jury, assembled. I sat in my chair by the broken storm door. The latch ticked against the frame in the December wind, that small, familiar rattle. The sound of the one thing in that house nobody but me had ever bothered to hold shut. I folded my hands. I waited. I'd learned a long time ago, sitting with frightened patience in the dark, that you don't fill a silence just to make yourself comfortable. You let it do its own work. So I let it. And across the table, my brother, who had spent his entire life being handed the head of the table, who had never once had to earn his chair, opened his mouth, and the whole night began to come apart. Theo didn't even make it through the blessing. He set down his fork before the plates were full and looked at me with eyes already wet. "I'm going to lose the house," he said, voice cracking. "Do you understand that? They're going to take my house." My mother reached for him. My father studied the chicken like it owed him an answer. "I have a wife. I have a life there," Theo said. "And you're sitting on $22 million. He said the number like an accusation. Like I'd pickpocketed it from him personally. "You could fix this with one phone call, and you won't." I kept my hands folded. "How much do you think would fix it, Theo?" I asked, evenly. He named it before he could stop himself. 12 million. The table went silent. Even the aunt looked startled by the size of it. 2 weeks earlier, he'd asked for a loan. Now, panicked, he'd jumped to over half of everything I had. As if 9 years of 100-hour weeks were a communal pot we were all meant to split. "At least 12, he said again, quieter now, hearing himself. "To be safe." Then my brother, 39 years old, slid out of the chair at the head of the table and went down onto our mother's kitchen floor on his knees, crying. Actually crying. The way I hadn't seen him cry since we were small children. "Please," he said. "Please, Ren. You're my sister. Don't let them take everything." And my mother, watching her son on the floor, turned the full weight of 36 years onto me. She stood so fast her chair scraped the tile. "Look at what you're doing to him," she screamed. "Look at your brother. You did this. You stole his future, Renata. You walked in here with your money and you stole his future." The clock ticked. The latch rattled. My brother wept on the linoleum, and my mother screamed that I was a thief. And every single face at that table turned toward me, waiting to watch me crumble, or cave, the way I always had before. I did neither. I looked at all of them, very calmly, and felt, of all things, a strange kind of peace, because I finally understood I was the only person in that room who actually knew what was true. And I was about to say it once, plainly, and never explain myself in that house again. I didn't raise my voice. I've found that the quieter you get, the louder a room is forced to become just to hear you, until everyone is leaning in despite themselves. "I want to say one thing," I said. "And then I'm going to finish my dinner and go home." My mother stayed standing, breathing hard. Theo looked up from the floor. "That house," I said, nodding toward the front of the property, "has had 2 names on the loan for 14 years. Theo's, and mine." Silence. My father's head came up slowly. "I'm not a co-signer," I said. "I'm a co-borrower." I own half of it. I have, since Theo was 27, when no bank on earth would lend to him a loan, and Mom and Dad drove out and asked me to put my name, and $4,000 of my savings, on the line so the family could buy its son a house. I let that settle. For 14 years, every time Theo came up short, I quietly covered it. $9,000 to $4,650, total. None of you knew. That is the only reason that house never went under. Maris had gone very pale. Theo's mouth hung open. My mother's righteousness flickered, just for 1 second, into something that looked almost like fear. Last week, I said, I stopped. That's all I did. I didn't sue anyone. I didn't take a single dollar from any of you. I simply stopped paying for a house that was never supposed to be mine to carry. The only way my name comes off that loan now is if Theo refinances it into his own name. And we all know he can't. I looked at my brother on the floor. You didn't lose your future, Theo. You've been living on mine since you were 27. I just finally stopped lending it to you. My mother found her voice, thin and shaking. Family money, she started, comes home to family. You're right, I said. And for the first time all night, I let myself smile, small and tired. It does. It's finally coming home. I picked my fork back up. Nobody moved. The clock ticked somewhere beneath the table. My father exhaled, long and low, like a man who had known this truth for 14 years and had only just been forced to hear it spoken aloud. I took a bite of chicken I had practically paid for myself. It was very good. For a moment, nobody in that kitchen knew what to do with a daughter who didn't flinch. Then my mother did the only thing she knew how to do. She got louder. After everything we sacrificed, she cried. We did our best. We could only ever bet on one horse. You know that. We told you that. I set down my fork and gave her the last thing I had to say, gently, because it wasn't an attack. It was simply, finally, the truth. You said you could only ever bet on one horse, Mom, I said. And you were right. But you spent 36 years staring at the wrong end of the stable. She stopped. You never once turned around to notice which one of us was actually carrying the whole barn. The aunt looked down at her plate. Maris had slid an inch away from Theo, the way people do when they realize they've bet on the losing hand. And my brother, still half collapsed on the floor, looked up at me with an expression I had never once seen on his face before. Not anger. Not even fear. Recognition. The dawning, 14 years late understanding of exactly who I had been to him all along, and what it had cost me, and how little any of them had ever once turned around to see it. I stood up. The chair by the broken door scraped back. The latch rattled in the wind, that old familiar sound nobody but me had ever bothered to hold against the cold. I wasn't going to hold it tonight. I put on my coat. My mother was still talking, the words getting smaller, the way a storm sounds once you've finally driven past it. I'm not angry at any of you, I said from the doorway. And I meant it, which surprised me most of all. I'm not going to fight you. I'm not going to sue anyone. I have spent my entire life in this family's ring, and I am finally walking out of it. I looked at Theo. I hope you figure out the house. I really do. But I won't be the one who figures it out for you. Not anymore. I looked at my parents. Don't call me about money. I won't answer. If you ever want to call me about anything else, anything that isn't a number, I'll pick up. The choice is yours. It always was. Then I opened the storm door, and the wind caught it. The broken latch banged against the frame the way it had my entire life. For 36 years, I had been the one who turned around to ease that door shut. To fix what no one else ever would. To hold the cold out, so everyone inside could stay comfortable. I stepped out onto the porch. I let the door swing. I didn't turn around. I didn't reach back. And behind me, I heard it bang once, twice, loose, and rattling, and finally, somebody else's problem.